All right, great, great. Okay, so welcome to the class. In this class, we will study core concepts of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So we will, we'll introduce what will be covered in a couple of minutes. So I know you are all proficient in programming. Okay, so in which we introduce concepts and constructs, and we did a lot of programming. This class, it's kind of like there is a little bit different. I mean, we still keep the same format, but a little bit different. The difference is the theoretical part will have more weight. So we will introduce a whole lot of concepts, theory, and procedures of artificial intelligence and machine learning. When we do programming to implement some ideas, we actually use what I call a black box or gray box, which means, well, actually these these are actually libraries someone has already implemented and they can share with us. So we just use the ready library to implement our ideas. So these we can do a little bit or maybe very few of them. So that's why we call it the black box or gray box. So yeah, so we will see. But that's very important because they are in our toolkit, right? So we're gonna use these open sources. Sometimes we call it open sources or external components. They are very useful and they are very handy. And some of them could be fairly complicated to use, but we need to learn a little bit before we can use it. Okay, so our format of class remains the same, okay? In each class, we spend 2 hours for each class. And in each class, in the first hour or so, we will focus on theoretical stuff, like concepts, theory, and procedures. In the second hour, we will spend our time to implement some useful or fun applications. Okay, so each class, you will receive a homework assignment. The submission of the homework is very important. I think that's the most important part. If you have questions, you are invited to the Discord group. So you should have already received that email. If you don't have that, just let me know. So I'll send you the invitation again. So in the Discord group, we can discuss whatever we need to discuss. In addition, for each class, within 2 hours, I'll send you what I call it a master document. And the master document is actually a link to a Google Doc. In that Google Doc, you have the video, the YouTube video of the class. That's number one. And you have PowerPoint slides of the class. And also you have homework assignment and homework submission link. So that way you have all information that you need to review. I urge you guys, I mean, after class, you should go through, the slides. Actually, you should review the slides. If you don't understand it, check out some like a YouTube or internet, Google the concepts, okay, and then bring your further questions to the Discord group to discuss. Okay, so now let me introduce our instructor of this class. It's Kevin Meng. Many of you know him, but some of you may not know him. Ask himself to introduce himself. I mean, ask him to introduce himself later. But before we switch to formal class, do you have any questions for me?
So in the Discord group, there's some old like master documents for like crash course on MIT App Inventor, do we just like disregard those?
Yes, you can. Well, we have a, so this is our idea. We don't separate. Okay, so all the students we invited to the same group so that you guys can communicate each other. Even the previous students to current students, you can talk. The more people you know, the better, right? So we don't want to isolate ourselves. Okay, so for previous documents, for this artificial intelligence class, this is the first time. There is no previous same homework assignments or materials over there. But yeah, disregard them. You don't need them. We will provide all the information that need in this class. Okay, any other questions? Okay, if we don't have other questions, let me hand the time over to Kevin. Kevin, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin. I am a freshman at MIT. I study computer science there. And I've been teaching for a while now, and I think it's really, really fun. And so that's why I'm doing this. I think AI is super, super interesting and quite accessible, actually, based on how people have recently been developing these extensions for MIT App Inventor and how educators are making this kind of material more accessible to young students. So I'm really excited to be sharing all of this with you today, and let's just dive right in. Just a couple of points as I start sharing my screen about sort of like the philosophy of this class. I think at this moment in time, we may not have the background to be able to understand exactly how these models work, but I think that it is very valuable simply just to know of their existence. Like you will be learning about some of the models where you'll think to yourself, oh my God, it's so complicated. How was anyone supposed to even think of this? How did anyone come up with this? And that's totally reasonable. Like once you get into high school and once you get into college, you'll sort of start to understand more and more about how these black boxes work. But this class will serve as a basic introduction, a basic survey of the field, where you'll be able to say, oh, I've heard of this model before. I know that it's good at these kinds of things, maybe not so good at those kinds of things. And you'll be able to start to develop some kind of intuition as to which models you'll need to use for what specific tasks. For example, we'll talk about, I mean, if you think about examples of AI in your daily lives, right? Siri, maybe your personal assistants, the Google Assistant. You might think of algorithms that help you schedule maybe your Ubers, how to find your Ubers, or maybe algorithms that play games against you, like if you play chess, how these algorithms are able to do so well. All of these kinds of things. You'll be able to start to intuit your way around how they work, sort of. And so this will basically be a very nice, subtle or introduction to the entire field. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the slides. So yeah, as the title suggests, this is an introduction to machine learning and artificial intelligence. One thing that you guys already probably knew is that AI is all around us. There are so many different things that AI can do, and it's really quite incredible because if you think about it, computers, what are they good at, right? They're very fast, they're very efficient, as opposed to humans, right? If you human were to try to sort through 30 hours of video footage, you'd take exactly 30 hours to read through it and possibly more to make notes. But AI can operate in faster than real time. You don't have to wait 30 hours. It'll scan through all the frames. And for example, in this case, it can detect all the cars, which could be very important for applications in law enforcement or in public safety to identify drunk drivers or otherwise dangerous things that are happening on the road. So obviously, computation is incredibly important in this 21st century that we're living in, and it's only going to become more important as these technologies mature. So you guys can probably all think of examples of AI around us. They manifest in lots of different subtle and maybe not so subtle ways. Like you can think of Siri, Cortana, Amazon Alexa. These are all things that use AI. Or if you think about even something as mundane as your autocomplete on your keyboard, when you're typing text to your friends, it can predict what the next word you're going to say is. And then sometimes you can click on it without having to type out the entire word. this uses AI. And in a future class, we'll explore how exactly this is done. And it's actually quite interesting. Or as you can see on the right side, there are these technologies that can help ensure the safety of humans. You think of self-driving cars for cars that can drive themselves, or even technologies that can help drivers become more intelligent, like lane assist, staying in your lane, making sure that you're not stepping on the dividing line. These are all technologies that use AI. So obviously this is a super important technology, and it's worth learning about. And with the development of all these cool new educational tools, this is finally possible. So today, we're going to be talking about a couple different things. So first of all, we will sort of more specifically define what exactly is AI, because it's a very general term. And we'll juxtapose it, or we'll compare it rather, with this idea of machine learning. Machine learning is actually not exactly the same thing as AI. It's what we call a subset of AI, but they're very interconnected, and we'll explain the differences between those. And then we'll sort of dive into an example that motivates why exactly we would need machine learning. This will show us, maybe the power of machine learning and why it's important. And then we'll dive into some machine learning vocabulary. This is just basic stuff that you need to know when you're dealing with machine learning. We'll also talk about some popular methods that people use in machine learning, like decision trees, linear models, etc. And then we'll talk about how exactly you build these machine learning models, this process of training and evaluation. So these these four sort of agenda points are all focused on machine learning, but we're going to be doing a lot of machine learning throughout the rest of this class. In fact, I think each one of the upcoming lessons is about machine learning and not so much about the other fields of artificial intelligence. So just as a really cool introduction, a nice introduction to this field, for our lab, we're going to switch away from machine learning. Once you've already become familiar with all these concepts, you'll sort of just store them in your brain, and then we'll talk about something a little bit different, which is playing rock, paper, scissors with AI. This is actually pretty cool. It's not technically considered machine learning, but it is definitely something that we can consider an artificial intelligence. So we will be showing you a cool application of that for a computer to beat you at rock, paper, scissors, and your homework will be to, pretty much fully implement this method. So yeah, that's going to be our schedule for today. Now, as I promised earlier, we're going to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and how this relates to things called machine learning and deep learning. So in general, artificial intelligence is a very, very vague term, right? It's something that's artificially intelligent. What we think of natural intelligence is humans or animals. Artificial intelligence is the intelligence that we try to encode into computers. And so as you can see, it's a program that can sense, reason, act, and adapt. Now on itself, this definition doesn't mean anything, right? Like literally anything can be considered to be intelligent, and it's sort of vague what this means. And to a certain extent, that's true, because there are lots of different things that you can consider artificial intelligence. When you start learning about algorithms, maybe when you get into high school or college, a lot of professors will actually tell you, oh, this very simple deterministic algorithm is what we consider artificial intelligence. So AI is actually a super general term that can almost apply to anything. Like an algorithm is technically intelligent. And so it doesn't help us much. So because of this, we need to make some additional definitions when we talk about different subfields of AI. So there's this very hot, new, trending subfield of AI called machine learning. And you've probably heard it before. And these are the algorithms whose performance will improve as they are exposed to more data over time. So this again is quite vague, but let's try to break it down. So machine learning is essentially about drawing insights from data. As you know, and maybe you don't know this, but everyone's collecting data about you these days. If you ever use Facebook, if you use Instagram, if you use Twitter, they're tracking you. Even Amazon, they want to know what you're looking at, what you're interested in buying. They want to show you ads that will make you click and buy their cool new product that you don't ever need, but you know, et cetera, et cetera. And there's just a lot of data going around these days. And especially with all these sensors like cameras, everyone has a webcam these days, or there are cameras everywhere on the streets. They're all collecting videos of people, and there's a lot of insight to be gained from this data, right? Like you can think about finding people who are drunk driving on the road using data, or you can think about determining what kinds of products people are more willing to buy using data, or looking at a bunch of emails and trying to pick out all the scammers who are trying to, steal your money, or things like that. So there's a huge amount of data in today's world, and machine learning is a method to learn from that data, to show a machine a bunch of examples and be like, this is spam, this is not spam. And then eventually you hope that this model will learn what is spam and what's not spam so that you can apply it to new unseen data and figure out what's going on. So of course, these are all very high level definitions. We're gonna get into the nitty gritty in a second. But then there's one final thing that I'd like to mention, which is deep learning. And so deep learning is a subset of machine learning that uses things called neural networks. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this before. You probably have. This is all over the news these days. But neural networks are these really cool things that can help us machine learn a lot better. Again, this is super vague, and we'll talk about this in very great detail in the next couple of lessons. But deep learning, you should just know that deep learning is something that has recently sometimes surpassed even human performance on a lot of different tasks. For example, diagnosing diseases like lung cancer or breast cancer or things like that. They've gotten super, super good at this, sometimes even surpassing human performance. So very exciting. We'll be talking about exactly how these things work in a future lesson. So these are the general sort of three big ideas that we'll be focusing on in this class. Now, this lecture will focus on machine learning, which is about looking at data and trying to derive insights from that. And then our lab will sort of zoom out and remind you that AI is not just about machine learning. There are so many different forms of AI. And in today's lab, we'll be exploring one of them, which is using this thing called a Markov chain to be better than average or better than random at playing rock, paper, scissors. So very cool. Let's dive in. Now, before we dive into everything, I'd just like to start out with a motivating example. I'm not sure if anyone has heard of this data set before, but it's sort of like the hello world of machine learning, which is the iris data set. So very pretty picture here. This is an iris flower. And apparently, and I'm no biology expert, but basically under this iris family of flowers, there are three sort of different subtypes of flowers. There's the virginica, there's the versicolor, and there's a setosa. So these are three different types of flowers. They're all under the same iris family. I'm not sure if that's the right term, but let's just call it the iris family. And say that you're a botanist going out into the field and you see some sort of random flower. You just like look on the ground and there's this flower there, and you're told that it's an iris flower. How do you determine which flower is which? Or in other words, you look at a flower and how do you know whether it's a setosa, or versicolor, or a virginica? This is a classic example of a classification problem, and we'll get into exactly what this means in a second. But basically, given some information about an object, how can we place it into one of these three categories, right? That's the fundamental idea here. So you can think about it as a machine learning problem in the manner that you have a bunch of flowers, right? You got these flowers, and you can describe them with a bunch of attributes. So sepal may not, I don't know if anyone has heard of a sepal, but it's like a flower part. You've all certainly heard of petals, right? Petals are the little things that the flowers like to, that I don't even know how to define a petal. It's just like a thing on the flower that looks very pretty. So you have a petal and you have a sepal, and there's this information with which we can describe each flower, right? For example, this is a virginica flower that has a sepal length of 6.7, I would guess probably centimeters or inches, depending on what the scale is. Let's just say centimeters. It has 6.7 centimeters sepal, and this sepal is also 3 centimeters wide. And then there's a petal length of 5.2 centimeters, and then a petal width of 2.3 centimeters. And this is apparently a virginica flower. So as you can see, we have a bunch of characteristics of these flowers that we want to use to determine which one it is. Because if you think about it, like, how would you approach this problem, right? If you looked at a flower and if you looked at these three flowers, what sort of characteristics distinguish them? Does anyone want to volunteer any ideas? I know I've already sort of exposed some of them, like the petal and the sepal, but what are some other features that you could use to distinguish among these three types of flowers? Feel free to throw your suggestions in chat or unmute yourself. Yeah, I think color is a really good thing here, right? Because, and this might be biased because of the specific flowers that we're looking at, but it looks like the setosa flower is a little bit of a deeper purple than the virginica, which is sort of washed out. And then maybe the versicolor lies somewhere in the middle. So this is a really good suggestion. Anyone else? So I think color is pretty much like, that's enough. That demonstrates that you understand what we're talking about here. So obviously color is one such feature. There's also petal length, petal width, sepal width. And these are all the features that we're going to be using to determine whether this is a virginica or a versicolor or a setosa. So my question to you now is, given all this data, suppose that, we didn't collect the color, just ignore the color for now. Imagine that we just have these couple of features. We have a bunch of numbers representing the sepal length, sepal width, petal width, and then we have what it's supposed to be. How would you if you were a programmer and you were given this data set, how would you code up a program that could take in these 4 numbers and output which species it was? This is a question for you. This is sort of like a discussion. How would you approach this problem? I feel like this one is a little bit more complicated, so feel free to unmute yourself and throw out some suggestions here. And as a hint, if you think back to perhaps MIT App Inventor, you learned about logic, right? You have if statements. So does anyone want to use that to derive some kind of algorithm or some kind of rule set to determine which one is which? And you don't have to give me the specific numbers, just like, how would you do it? Okay, so Everett has a suggestion. Maybe each flower has a certain size of petals or sepals, so you can group them like that. That's exactly what I was looking for. Good job. So yeah, you take all these sepals, and obviously, given that we're trying to group them, or we're using these features of their size, perhaps a natural continuation of this idea would be, well, different species of flowers are of different sizes. Maybe the setosas are smaller, I don't know. They seem generally smaller if you look at the numbers than the virginica flowers. The versicolor ones are perhaps somewhere in between. This is just by eyeballing it. This is what I'm seeing. So Everett's idea is basically to say, let's write a bunch of rules, right? Let's say if one of the sizes, or perhaps the average of the sizes, is less than a certain number, then it's a setosa, the smallest one. Otherwise, it's the bigger version, maybe a versicolor or a virginica. So you could create these set of rules using your if statements that you learned about in MIT App Inventor, right? Like if sepal length is less than a value, then do this, otherwise do this. And that's exactly what I was thinking. So you can create a set of rules. And in this case, there is a really nice structure to how these species are organized with respect to each other, which is if the petal length is less than 1 centimeter, then it's a setosa. And then if it's greater than or equal to 1 centimeter, then you need to check the petal width. And then if it's less than this, then it's a versicolor. If it's greater than or equal to this, then it's a virginica. So this might not be perfectly precise because we don't see any mention of the sepal length and sepal width, but this is sort of the idea here. You try to create this, what is called a decision tree. We'll be talking about what this is later, but this is perhaps the most intuitive solution, right? You write a set of rules, like your petal length, you can eyeball it. You're like, okay, the petal lengths, the setosas are all super small. So if it's less than 1 centimeter, let's just call it a setosa. Otherwise, execute this new logic. Very nice. So the iris data set turns out to be quite simple. And if you constructed an optimal decision tree, it would look something like this, right? Very simple, not too many nodes in your tree. But what about more complex problems? Does anyone want to suggest perhaps a more complicated problem than classifying 3 flowers that could use machine learning that maybe isn't so easy to eyeball? Again, feel free to unmute or type some suggestions in chat. Compare arrays of data. Okay, interesting. Thanks. Okay, so I really like the second suggestion. So medical diagnosis, right? Because it's very complicated. If you're thinking about something like breast cancer, right? You think about perhaps there are risk factors for breast cancer. Perhaps genetics is one of them. Or for example, if we take another example like diabetes, which I'm a little bit more familiar with, diabetes has lots of different risk factors. Like you can think about your diet, you can think about your exercise, whether you smoke or not. And of course, genetics plays a huge role in diabetes as well. So there are a whole lot of different factors. and they play together in very complicated ways. Like, for example, your diet could influence the way that you exercise, or vice versa, or your genetics can influence the way that you diet, or things like that. So it's a very complex set of relationships, and it's not so easy to eyeball. In this case, we just eyeballed it, and we were just like, setosa flowers are super small. So if we took this feature in, if it's less than 1 centimeter, it's a setosa. It's not so simple when we think about medical diagnoses. So one example of this is if you look at a picture of a cancer cell, or just any cell in the body, and you want to determine whether or not it's malignant or benign, which means it's cancerous or is it not. This is quite actually a simple decision tree, and it's already quite complicated. And if you look at it, you'll realize that there's no way you ever could have eyeballed this. You can't just look at a bunch of numbers and be like, yes, this is the optimal decision tree that minimizes the error. You can't do that. And there's so many different things that you need to take into account when you think about benign or malignant. Uniformity of cell size. So are they all the same, or are they not really the same? And then this doesn't actually tell you whether it's benign or malignant. If you can see on the left and the right of the decision tree, you have both different classifications, and you need to look at so many different considerations before you actually make a decision as to whether it's good or a bad cell. And then, the more complicated the problem, the more insane the decision tree becomes. There's no way in heck you could have guessed that this would be the decision tree that would have minimized the error on this really complicated data set. So things are starting to get a little bit complicated, and data is very messy. It's very complicated. There are all these confounding variables. They're all messing with each other. And in the first place, there are just so many variables. So clearly this isn't going to work. Like, in the very beginning, we have this machine learning problem that we could have solved just by looking at it, but we're getting to these increasingly complicated and complex things where it's not as easy to draw these easy decision boundaries. So that's where machine learning comes in. Now, as I talked about a little bit earlier, machine learning is essentially, in a nutshell, something that allows computers to learn and infer from data. And I think that a better way of putting this is that ML draws insights from data. If you think about gathering a data set of people, and each person, that this person smokes, they don't eat well, they eat lots of sugary foods like donuts, they don't exercise, and they have a genetic predisposition for diabetes. And you should be able to look at this data set, and of course you'll have many other people, like maybe some other person, it has a very good diet, does not smoke, exercises a lot, but has a genetic predisposition for diabetes and still gets diabetes. So all of these kinds of things, if you have a data set of these people, you can use machine learning to draw insights from data. And you can be like, if somebody has a genetic predisposition for diabetes, then they have maybe an 80% chance of having diabetes, given that they exercise and they diet properly and things like that. So you can basically take all this data, which is completely unstructured, and you can be like, oh, there are these cool patterns in the data that might show us something interesting about how diabetes works, or in other cases, maybe how to drive a car, or how to play chess, or how to play rock, paper, scissors. So all of these different things are all about drawing insights from data. So as I talked about earlier, machine learning takes so many different forms, and it's very cool. Like, you can think about your junk email. I'm sure that most of you have emails at this point. If you look at your junk, how does Google know to put certain emails in your spam and certain emails not into your spam? Certainly they don't have a person sitting there going through every single of the billions of emails that are sent maybe every year, and marking each one as spam or not. No, it's a computer. And because of the sheer scale of the internet and data these days, you need computers to do it, and machine learning is a perfect task to do this. If you think about vehicle driver assistance, trying to detect things in your blind spots when you're driving, or maybe even self-driving cars, fraud detection, is anyone swiping your credit card and trying to steal money from it? Web search, how does Google know how to give you the results that are most relevant to what you're looking for? Or things like this, et cetera, and et cetera. There's so many complicated problems that are now solvable using machine learning methods that it's becoming almost an essential skill to have. So let's dive in. Now, machine learning can generally be split up into two parts. So you can have this thing called supervised learning and unsupervised learning. Supervised learning is when your data points have a known outcome, and unsupervised learning is when your data points have an unknown outcome. Now, this in itself is not a very good definition, so let's try to understand this by looking at some examples. Well, actually, for now, we're just going to focus on supervised learning, where the data points have a known outcome. And you'll start to see what I mean by data points have a known outcome. So within supervised learning, there are actually two types of problems. One is called regression and one is called classification. Classification is when you're trying to put things into bins, basically like we were doing with the iris flowers. And then regression is when you're trying to predict a numerical value. Say, if, given these features about the sky outside, try to predict me the inches of snowfall. If you were in Boston or something, you would try to predict how much snowfall there's going to be. It's not simply whether there is or is not going to be snowfall. We want exactly how many inches of snowfall you think we'll be able to see. And if you think about it, this is sort of what the weatherman does. They use these methods of learning, and that's how they can predict, they're going to be 2 inches of snow overnight or something like that. They're probably using some kind of regression combined with classification. So these are the two types of supervised learning that we'll be focusing on. And this is sort of the big roadmap of supervised learning. And of course, this might be a little bit complicated or strange to understand right now, but as we get into some more examples, it'll become more and more obvious. So remember that we said that machine learning is about drawing insights from data. And underlying all of this data is some rule, right? Some universal rule. I don't know, maybe God designed it, I don't know. But there's this universal rule that governs what exactly this data is showing, right? Like the laws of biology govern, given all of these facts about a person, whether they smoke, whether they eat right, whether they exercise right, whether they have diabetes. There is some law of biology here. But biology is super, super complicated. And there's no way that we'd ever be able to capture all of this into a model. Like our entire lives are basically built upon modeling things. And modeling is basically the idea of taking a very complicated process and simplifying it. So we're trying to sort of suss out what exactly is the model behind this process of a person eating right, exercising, having, or smoking, and then that connection with diabetes. And we learn this using machine learning. So if we have a bunch of data, and this data is a bunch of like examples of people with their behaviors, like their, whether they smoke, whether they eat, whether they exercise, and then the answer, which is whether they actually have diabetes or not, and you give it to a model, and you call this fit. So fit is where the model tries to figure out the underlying structure behind this data, and it's like, okay, I've got it down now, and you get a cool model. So this model understands what the underlying structure is, what the processes are that correlate the inputs with the outputs. And then so in the future, if you have a random dude walking around on the street who smokes, who eats right, who exercises a lot, and has a predisposition for diabetes, and you give it to the model will look at this data and be like, based on what I've learned from the data that I was trained on, this person should have diabetes or should not have diabetes, or et cetera. So this is the entire idea of supervised learning, giving a model a bunch of data so that the model can figure out what's happening with this data, so that the next time you show it some new data, it can use that knowledge that it gained to output the correct answer.
So question for Kevin. So you have two models. One is little model. The other is the bolded model. So can I understand? Can I think this way? The little model is kind of like an agency without education, and the bolded model is the one that after training, which means after education, and it's ready to solve some problems or make predictions.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. So you start out with a model, like you can think of it as a student-teacher situation where the data is trying to teach the student, and the student initially doesn't really know anything. And then once you fit it, you get a student who has graduated from college, if you can think of it that way. And now your model is able to take in new information and still predict the right answer. So yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it as well.
So, but what is the difference inside, let's say, little model and a big model? What is, okay, so a model is some variables with some parameters. So what is difference between these two?
Yeah, that's a good question, but I won't get into that right now because that's a little bit further down because we haven't really discussed what a model is. But you can think of it this way. Your model has a bunch of parameters that you can tweak, right? A bunch of knobs that you can turn. So you can think of the model as maybe yeah, let's just say a bunch of knobs, and you can turn these knobs to make the model smarter or dumber or more correct or less correct. And the process of fitting this model is basically going into this model and tweaking all the knobs. These are called the parameters, tweaking them so that once you give it the data, it'll give you the right answer. And in this process of tweaking these knobs, you will somehow discover something interesting about the underlying distribution of data. And then in the future, when you see new data, you'll be able to predict the right answer from it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that's an excellent answer. Right.
All right, cool. Yeah, those are good questions. So I think this is a good point to stop and ask for any other questions and see if everyone's keeping up. So like you can go into the thing and react with send some reactions over so that I can get a gauge for how people are doing. If you're confused or if you're good, just react with a thumbs up or etc. Okay, great. Looks like people are generally keeping up. And if you have any questions, feel free to unmute. All right, cool. So I've been talking a lot about features, targets, examples, labels, all of these different things, and they're probably confusing. And so at this point, it's probably a good idea to clarify some of these. So let's look at all of these. Your target is your predicted category or value of the data, features, properties of the data used for prediction. And then the example is a single data point within the data, which is a combination of the target and the features. And then the label is the target value for a single data point. Now these words, they don't really mean anything on their own. So I think it's a good idea to use an example here. And we'll go back to the iris data set. Now these are words that you will see very, very commonly in machine learning. So it's a good idea to understand what they are. Your features are shown in red, which are the things that you want to be making predictions using. So your features are actually very, very important to your decision process, because if you choose features that are useless, then you won't be able to make any meaningful predictions. Because imagine if we're trying to predict which flower this is, and our feature is, let's say, the soil in which it was grown, right? These two variables have pretty much no correlation, or they don't really influence each other. And so this would not be a very good feature to choose, this type of dirt that it was grown in. Instead, if we look at features that actually produce separation between the species, because we know that Virginica, Setosa, versicolor, they're different sizes, then naturally the size of the flower is a very good feature to have. And so here you have the target or the label. And in this case, we have that this 4.8, 3.0, 1.4, 0.1 corresponds to the Setosa flower, which is the target label. So this is the label here. And then if you combine the features in the label, you get an example, which is this entire versicolor flower is associated with its features. And that's one example in your table. And then so in this, you can think of this as a matrix. All of the rows, the number of rows is equal to the number of distinct examples that you have. And then the number of columns is the number of features plus one, because then you have the species, which is the target label. So if you stack all this into a big matrix, this is what you get. This is your data set from which you're going to derive some insights. So one thing to note is that your features will almost always need to be converted into a numerical format because of the nature of these models. These models are working on continuous inputs. And even in the case, as we'll see, with very non-numerical things like words, if we wanted to do what we said at the very beginning, which is to predict the next word that you're going to type when you type in on this keyboard, which is this thing, it's like autocomplete. We need to convert words into a numerical representation, which is going to be quite interesting, and we'll talk about that later. But this is just something to keep in mind. Machine learning does not play well with discrete inputs. It really likes numerical inputs. So that is something to keep in mind that we will explore going forward. All right, so this basically gives us all we need to know about the basics of machine learning and its vocabulary. So we know that you have a big data set from which you're trying to derive insights. You have features that are being fed into the model, and then you have a model, and then it produces an output, and then the output should be hopefully correspond to the label, which is the correct answer, and then you have each example, which is the combination of a feature and a label. That's pretty much all you have to know from this section. Now, given all this information, we can actually start talking about some of the classical methods that people have used to perform supervised and unsupervised learning. And today, or right now, we're going to start with classification and decision trees. So decision trees, we already talked about a little bit, because this decision tree that Everett recommended to us, the idea of grouping things by flower, this is actually a decision tree. But the only difference is that this decision tree we got by eyeballing everything. And in the other case, in these really complicated cases, we can't really eyeball them. So we need an algorithm to find these decision trees. So let's talk a little bit about how this might work. So throughout this lecture, I'm going to be using a bunch of different examples to give you more familiarity with the sort of types of problems that people solve using machine learning. And in this case, we'll be doing this thing. This is a data set of a person playing tennis. So apparently this person plays tennis outside, and they're really picky about the temperature, the humidity, the wind, the outlook. And in certain conditions, they don't like to play tennis. For example, when it's really sunny and hot and it's humid, sticky outside, this person doesn't like to play tennis, and et cetera, et cetera. So the decision tree is a very natural way of thinking, right? This might be the way that you think about things in your daily life. For example, if you're trying to decide whether to wear a raincoat outside, does anyone want to propose a decision tree for that problem? Like, how would you determine whether you want to wear a raincoat outside? Anyone want to unmute and share?
If it's raining, wear a raincoat.
F rainy.
Yeah, right. If it's raining, you wear a raincoat. And I was thinking that it might be a little bit more complicated because, for example, if you're not going to be outside for very long, then you might not need to wear a raincoat, right? So it would basically look like, if it's not raining, then obviously no. So like we can write this down. So like raining, this is your first decision. And if it's a no, then obviously you don't want to do that. And then if it's a yes, then you would ask another question, outside, like, am I going to be outside? And if the answer is no, then probably you don't even need a raincoat. And then if the answer is yes, then you need a raincoat, right? So this is a decision tree. This is probably the decision tree that you would go through when you're trying to determine whether you want to wear a raincoat or not. So these are very easily eyeballable. Unfortunately, it's not so easy with this really fickle person who has who's very picky about the weather. I don't know what this guy's doing. But as you can see, very picky. How do we build such a decision tree, right? Well, first of all, let's just figure out what exactly a decision tree is, and then we'll talk about this later. So in this case, we're trying to predict whether to play tennis based on all these parameters about the weather. And we're trying to find features on which to divide. For example, in our first case, when we were talking about the raincoat, the first feature that we wanted to divide on was very obvious, because if it's not raining, then you're sure as heck not going to need a raincoat, probably. So that was the feature on which we decided to divide the data set. And we just continually do this until we reach a really nice ending point. So we're not going to dive very specifically into how decision trees are built, but I'll give you the general intuition for how this works. So this is the pseudocode, very vague pseudocode. So how decision trees are built? They're built greedily. This is a term that you'll probably learn when you study algorithms, maybe. It's called greedy, and it makes a lot of sense that it's called greedy because you always choose the optimal thing at that step. So basically, the process is you pick a feature. So in this case, we might pick weather. We might pick like temperature, not weather. We might pick temp. We might pick humid. We might pick outlook, which is, whether it's cloudy, sunny, or whatever. We pick one of these features. Say we pick the outlook. And then we split the feature optimally based on some equation. There are these different things that I won't talk very specifically about, but you should know about. They're called, you can use the Gini index, or you can use this thing called entropy. You can basically find a way to split the outlook so that it's optimal. And then you have a decision tree, right? You have the outlook, and you can say that, if it's sunny or like cloudy, then you have some other problem here. And then if it's raining, then you have some other problem here. And then you can use what's called recursion to then solve each of these different subproblems. So this is a little bit beyond the scope of this course, but this is what you should generally know. So like to construct a decision tree, you find a feature where if you split it, it'll give you the best optimal split. And basically the idea is if you can split it and most of the decisions that you get are correct, then you're good. That's the best feature to be splitting on. And so let's say that the best feature to split on is Outlook, because when it's raining, you definitely don't want to go outside. Then this would be a good feature to split on, because once you split on Outlook, approximately, or not necessarily half, but a big portion of your answer is already going to be immediately decided, which is no. So Outlook would be a good feature to split on. If you had another thing, for example, if you split on humidity and you get like 50-50 here and 50-50 here, this is very bad, right? Because you split this at humidity, and then each of these two different buckets are still really bad. You still have a 50-50 chance of yes, no, and yes, no. So this would be a very bad split. It's going to have a very poor Gini index. It's going to have a very poor entropy, and you wouldn't want to split it on there. So basically, you find the feature at which the split would be best, and then you split it there, and then you recursively solve down the tree. And that's the general intuition for how decision trees are built. So this is the algorithm. I don't think.
Question. So
Yeah.
that means you say we want to split it so that the left-hand side, let's say you have a binary cut, right? This is a one cut split into two parts. So the left part and the right part, they are different.
Right.
As much as possible, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
that's basically what the Gini index and entropy are trying to say. And that's a very good point. So let's like run through an example. If you had a decision D,
that would be easy to understand. I mean, instead of a Gini index, not everyone understands.
Right. So if you had a decision D and you had a yes and a no here, and on the left-hand side, you had basically a bunch of yeses and you had a bunch of no's, and you had like a 50-50 split. This is very bad because when you split, you didn't really help yourself. You're still very confused. These buckets are all very mixed. This is a bad split. But if you had a decision D prime and you had two different spots and you had all yeses here and you had all no's here, this is a very, very good split, right? Because based on this singular split, you've completely separated the data set into the yeses and the no's. And this is a very good split to use. So basically at every step, you pick the best split and then you repeat and you recursively do it until all of the leaves are pure. So that's how decision trees are built. But basically, what you have to know from this is that decision trees are basically a way of taking a bunch of information and applying this very intuitive if logic. If the temperature is greater than or equal to mild, then do this. But if it's less than mild, then we don't want to play tennis. And there's this algorithm that you don't have to know the very specifics for, but the idea is that you try to split it the best possible at every single step. And then you just keep doing this until you have a very nice tree where you have these rules that can define the structure that you have learned. So that's the general idea. Any questions here?
Good.
Okay, great. So these are decision trees. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is a little bit different. It's called k-nearest neighbors. And I think this one is also super intuitive. So let's motivate this with an example, right? There is a data set of people, and these people are represented on two axes. You have their age, and you have the number of cancerous nodes that they have, let's say, in their body. Like maybe this is on the order of, I don't know how many cells, but let's just say millions or billions of cells, maybe 10 to the 9 or whatever. So you have these like cells, and you have these people who are trying to fight cancer. And you want to know, given some new person, whether they survived or did not survive. Now, a very easy way of trying to perform this classification is to say, if somebody is age 40 and has 5 cancer nodes, so they would be here. Well, an easy way to figure out whether they're going to die or not is to look at the people that are close to them, right? If somebody was age 40 and had 5 malignant nodes, well, it would be a good estimate of their outcome to basically look in their near neighbors to say, okay, if somebody was age 41 and had 6 cancerous nodes, well, they're pretty similar to our dude. So maybe we can think about their outcome when deciding the new dude's outcome. And in fact, you maybe don't want to just look at one, right? Does anyone want to provide an example where if you only look at the nearest neighbor, the one nearest neighbor, we would have an issue?
The guy who's about like 20 years old and has a little bit more than 10 to whatever.
Yeah, exactly, right? This guy is what we would call an outlier. Maybe this guy was a heavy smoker and then he ended up dying at age 20, which is quite unfortunate. So this is an outlier, but it doesn't represent the general population. So if you had a person that was age 22 and had 11 cancerous nodes, and you looked at the one nearest neighbor, you would think that they would die. But in fact, in general, you can see that if you look at a couple more nearest neighbors, you in general will not die if you are 20 and have 10 cancerous nodes, even though that you only looked at the nearest neighbor. So this is a really good observation. Now, how do we fix this, basically? Does anyone have any suggestions for fixing this?
It's like you look at all of the neighbors and see if there's more ones that survived or didn't survive.
Ah, okay. This is a really good suggestion. So essentially, this k here is the hyperparameter that determines how many nearest neighbors we look at. So Everett brought up something quite interesting. He said, look at all of the neighbors. So when you say all of the neighbors, what do you mean? Like, do you mean the entire data set, or do you mean just like k is not the entire data set?
Well, like the ones that are like closest to it. Like
Yeah,
maybe
right? So maybe like, let's just say k, oh, this is a bad k equals 4 or something. So then if k equaled 4 and you were here, then you would check off this one, you'd look at this one, maybe you look at this one, you would look at this one and maybe look at this one. And then so you have 3 survived, and then you had 1 died. So you'd probably think that they survived, right? So in fact, this is exactly what k nearest neighbors is. You guys just invented k nearest neighbors by yourselves, which is quite impressive. So this is what k nearest neighbors is. If you wanted to predict a new person that comes in and they're age 20, they've got like 11 cancerous nodes, and you wanted to predict, and if you only looked at k equals 1, then you'd probably think they die. But again, this is an outlier. So if we look at k equals 2, there's a tie. But if we look at k equals 4, there is not so much a tie. There's a pretty big consensus that this person is probably going to survive and is probably going to be okay. So this is another way of doing machine learning, right? Because you have a bunch of data and you look at all of the things that are very close to this piece of data, and you're like, well, let's just make the assumption that if I'm similar to other people, then my outcome, the target that we're trying to predict, is going to be a similar target to me. So then we're going to predict that this person is going to survive. Now, an interesting point, if you took k and you set it like, if you let it tend towards infinity, then k would be the entire data set. Does anyone see any problems with this?
It doesn't really let you analyze for any particular situation.
Yeah, exactly, right? Because then you'll predict the same thing for everything. That was just like a quick concept check. So if you set k to infinity, then it'll literally average everything. And then so no matter where you are on here, you will consider all the nearest neighbors, which is the entire data set. And then you won't have a decision boundary. It'll just be whichever data point is more common in the data set will become the thing that you predict at every single point. So that's not very useful. And that's not good. So you'll want to set k. K is not something that's learned. It is what we call a hyper parameter, which is something that the machine learning practitioner needs to set manually. So there's not a very good standard for figuring out what hyperparameters are supposed to be, other than just trying things and maybe looking at the data. Like if you looked at the data, you would clearly know that k should not equal 1 because this would be bad. So you sort of just have to look at the data and then guesstimate what you want the k value to be. So yeah, any questions about this? And yeah, Benjamin is right. Not all the data is relevant. So that's basically equivalent to saying you don't want to just average the entire data set. So that's good.
So in this example, there's like a definite line between they're gonna die and they're gonna survive. So how would the AI how would the machine learning, how would it like see what the probability is? Would it just draw a defined line, or in a certain area be like 50-50?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So k-nearest neighbors, you might consider that, and in general, in machine learning, the probabilities sometimes aren't very well defined. So in this case, a very easy way to come up with a fraction is to say that if you look at the 4 nearest neighbors, then 75% of them survived. So then you would say that there's a 75% chance. I don't think this is very well defined. It's sort of like misleading in some sense, because it's not precisely a probability, but this is one way that you could get a number out of this. And so earlier you also mentioned that there's a very defined line here, right? You would think that this is sort of like the decision boundary, where everything on this side is going to be survive and everything on this side is going to be die. And you'd be right. Like, we can derive a classification boundary using k-nearest neighbors, basically by, if you think about every single point on here, and if you think about what it would be classified as, this one would probably be classified in this class, this point would probably be classified in this class. And if you just did this for every single point on the continuous plane, then you would probably come up with a decision boundary, something like this. And anything that is below this line would be classified as survive, and everything above would be classified as death. And that's one way you can come up with the decision boundary for k-nearest neighbors. It's something that you can derive from how the algorithm works. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, great questions. Anything else from anyone? Okay, awesome. So this was k-nearest neighbors, quite intuitive, quite easy, but in many cases, quite powerful. So yeah. Now, we've talked a lot about classification, but we haven't talked so much about regression. This is probably something that a lot of you have seen before. We'll not get into the specific math about how these are solved, but there is a very specific class of linear models that can do linear regression. And in this case, we'll be talking a little bit about that. Now, just to preface all of this, in fact, you can do regression with k-nearest neighbors, and you can do regression with decision trees. And I'll talk about how we do that in a second. But first, let's sort of establish what regression is about, and then we can work backwards from there. Oh, okay. Ben, did you have a question? Okay. Okay. Yeah, no worries. All good. So anyways, regression is the problem of trying to predict some continuous value from a set of features. So you have this dependent variable that you're trying to predict. You're trying to predict, let's say, the box office of a movie from its budget. So like, that generally the more money that people spend on a movie, the better the movie stars that you can get, the better the production equipment you can get. So generally it'll be a better movie, and this might correlate with a higher box office. And this is a data set of all movies with their budgets and their box offices. So clearly there was this huge flop where they spent lots and lots of money and then didn't make lots and lots of money. They actually lost this amount of money, which is bad. And then, you have this movie that's very much outperformed its budget. So there's this whole distribution of movies and things, and we want to predict, given some new movie, let's say that, there was a budget at 1.5 times 10 to the $8, where do you think the box office would end up? So this is the problem of regression. Now, in regression, if we have a guess, let's just say that, we ran the regression, we solved it, and we got these two parameters. This is 80 mil, and this is 0.6, whatever unit this is. And we have this, then we can do the prediction, right? Because if there's something that comes in at a $160 million budget, we would plug this into our function here, and we would get a box office of approximately 175 million. So this is good. It's like a good estimate. And this is the purpose of linear regression. So this is basically how we how we use linear regression to our purposes. Now, the question is, the $1 million question is, how exactly do you find this line, and who defines this line to be the best line, right? Because, what if the line was like this? This seems like a reasonable line, right? This seems like a reasonable regression line. Some might even argue that this is a reasonable regression line, or maybe this is a reasonable regression line, or whatever it is. So there are a lot of different possibilities for formulating this regression line. How do we find the one that does the best? Now, the methods that we will use to compute this will require calculus and linear algebra. So you'll get into that when you study these methods in the future, but I'll give you a sort of taste of how this is done. So this is, and this plays into a very important topic generally in machine learning called a loss function. Now, a loss function basically quantifies how stupid your model is. It's a very easy way of saying this. So let's say that your model produces this line, right? This is parameterized by 80 million beta 0 and then 0.6 beta 1. Now, here, this is your model, right? And if you look at the training data, all of these orange points are the training data. You can tell that clearly this model doesn't fit the training data very well, right? Because if you predicted this budget, let's just say of 1.0 times 10 to the 8, it predicts it perfectly, right? So the error here is 0. But if you have, this budget right here, your regression line would predict this this value around 1.8 times 10 to the 8. But unfortunately, the movie that corresponds to this was actually 0.5 times 10 to the 8. So there are a series of residuals or errors that we can compute. So like this one was bad here, this one was really bad, this one is okay, this one is sort of bad, this one is pretty bad, this one is fine, this one's fine, this one's kind of bad, this one is really bad, this one is almost perfect, this one is bad, this one is almost perfect, this one is okay, this one is sort of bad. So you compute all these residuals. This is the difference between y predicted and then minus y true, or the other way around. It sort of depends on how you formulate it. So you have all of these errors, right? This is the error for some index I. This is a very bad I. The error at index I is equal to, let's just say yi, and this is the predicted minus the true. And let's just say we take this error and we square it because we don't care whether it was positive or negative error. So this is the error for each data point. And does anyone want to suggest what we want to do with this error? Like, do we want it to be big or small, first of all? This is a very easy question. It's not a trick question.
Small.
Yeah, we want it to be small, right? So we want to minimize this error. Minimize. We want to minimize the error. Now, how do we do this? Does anyone have a way that we can rewrite this equation that'll make it very obvious how we want to minimize this error? And of course, we want to sum over all the i's so we can get rid of this. Does anyone want to suggest a way to rewrite this equation? So I know that question is very vague. So let's give you a hint. How do you quantify why I predicted? How can we rewrite this expression? There's a hint on this slide.
That's beta 0 plus beta 1x.
Yeah, exactly, right? Because the regression line that we predict here is parameterized by beta 0 plus beta 1 xi. And so we can rewrite this equation as the error is equal to the sum over all the data points. And then so we have beta 0 plus beta 1 xi minus yi true. And then we square it. So given this, it becomes sort of obvious what we want to do, right? Because we have these two interesting parameters. We have beta 0 and beta 1. Here, let me highlight it. We have these two things, beta 0 and beta 1, that we can sort of tune. Remember I was talking earlier about knobs on a little dashboard where you can tune these knobs so that your error is really small. These are exactly the knobs that we want to be tuning to make our error small, beta 0 and beta 1. So in more mathematical lingo, this is actually considered the minimization over beta 0 and beta 1 of the error. And this error is defined here. So basically what we're trying to say is, if you wanted to brute force this, if you wanted to try all possibilities, you would just search through all the possible values of beta 0 and beta 1, you combine all of them, and you figure out which one gives you the smallest error, right? Does that make sense? And in this, you're trying all of these different possible lines. You're trying this line, you're trying that line, you're trying this line, you're trying all these random lines until you settle on this very nice line, which gives you the minimization of this error. And so this is the optimal beta 0, beta 1. Let's call it beta 0 star, beta 1 star. This gives you the best possible betas that you can have. And this is the optimal solution, and that's the model that you would want. Now, of course, this is very stupid, right? You don't want to just try all the beta 0s and try all the beta 1s. There's actually some cool math that we can use to figure out what these are very quickly and analytically. So you can write out the expression exactly. We won't talk about that today because it requires a little bit of extra knowledge, but I hope this makes sense. You have this error function that defines how stupid your model is, and then you use an algorithm to figure out how to minimize that error to make your model a lot smarter, so that it can make these predictions much more reliably. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about this? Okay, great. And again, don't be intimidated by all of these expressions. They're just a way for us to formalize everything we're talking about. Just forget about all of this, right? Linear regression is about finding a line that is able to model this data most accurately. And we define that by minimizing an error function. We want to minimize how dumb the model is so that it becomes much smarter. So that's basically what we're doing here. All right. And so this is actually exactly what I just wrote out. We just sort of derived all of this. This is the cost function. As you can see, it's beta 0 plus beta 1 times xi minus yi. You square all of it, you sum all of it, and then you try to minimize it over beta 0 and beta 1. So we just basically rediscovered what they were trying to teach us on the next slide. So good on us. All right. So this is regression, right? Basically, you're given a bunch of features and you're given a target and you're able to predict the target from the features. Now, in this case, does anyone, just as a quick concept refresher, how many features do we have and what is it? And what is the target variable here? Just to make sure we're all paying attention. Feel free to type in chat or unmute. So let's see.
There is one target for sure. But how many?
Okay, right.
Right. How many features?
So
that's a question.
Yeah, let's have some of the students answer. So let's see. Who haven't I heard from today?
Kevin says 3.
Oh wait, Kevin says 3. Interesting. Cool. Kevin, do you mind unmuting to explain your thought process?
So like you have the inputs, and then you have the output, I guess, which is like the betas.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so, okay, that's one interpretation. Does anyone else disagree with Kevin? Or does anyone else agree with Kevin that we have 3 things? Everett, any thoughts? All right. So let's remember what exactly a feature and what is a target. So does anyone want to give me the definition of a feature?
Types of data that you can use to like figure out your output.
Yeah, exactly, right? So the data that we use to figure out the output, and then we have an output here. So what, well, let's just attack half of it at a time, right? We're trying to predict the box office. So this is our target. We're trying to figure out the box office of a movie given some information about it. And so what information are we currently using and how many pieces of information do we have? Yeah, exactly, right? The budget. And if I can count, that's one thing. So exactly, we have one feature here, which is the budget. We're trying to use the budget to create a box office. Now, it can be argued that the budget is not such a great feature to be using. Does anyone else want to suggest any other features that maybe we should have incorporated here?
Director and actors.
Right. Like the reputation of the actors, the reputation of the directors, or how much they spend on marketing. This is different from the budget. The budget might be all wasted on useless things, but how much do they spend marketing this material? Or how many fans do they have on social media or whatever? These are all different features that you could use to predict the box office. The budget is only one of them. And this brings up something very important in machine learning, which is that you need to select your features very carefully because they will make or break your model. No matter how cool, no matter how fancy your model is, if you don't have good data, if you don't have good features, then you will not have a good model. So of course, you can use the budget, but what about the actor, director, reputation? This is important. Also, the amount of monies spent on marketing. This is all very important, and that's not exactly the budget. So, et cetera, et cetera. As a machine learning person, you will have to understand how to identify all of these kinds of things, right? Cool. So this was my little aside. Now we're going to jump into a very quick introduction to something called clustering. I won't be talking very much about it, but this is called the k-means clustering algorithm. So k-means is very simple. And in unsupervised data, we have no unknown outcome. So does anyone want to explain to me what the table would look like? You know, in supervised learning, we had a table that looked like this. Does anyone want to suggest what would happen if we didn't have any, if we were unsupervised? What changes about this table?
No target label.
Right, exactly. So we have no species, then we just have to cross all this out. And so this would be an unsupervised learning table. Now, this is weird, right? Because we're trying to figure out something about this data without actually knowing what it should be. And in this case, this is called clustering. So one such thing you can do with unsupervised data is to look at all this data and ask, well, what is similar about all of these things and what is different about all of them? And can we group them into different categories based on how similar or how dissimilar they are? Now, this is very, very important because in the real world, data often comes in unlabeled forms, right? Like I'm trying to think of an example. Maybe you have a dash cam and it's constantly recording video of the road in front of you. There's no one to label that video. There's no one to tell you, hey, there's a person there, or hey, there's a car there. But what if you could learn from this video something? If you could learn something from this video without asking a human to go through and annotate all of the data with a target column, then you have major profit. This is very good because in machine learning, often the most expensive thing is to label your data. And therefore unsupervised learning is super, super important. So let's come back to unsupervised learning. One such thing you can do with unsupervised learning is to do clustering. This is one of the many, many different unsupervised learning tasks. And we won't talk about all of them today. Feel free to ask later if you're curious. But clustering is basically taking a set of data and trying it to partition it into groups that are similar. This could be very important in customer segmentation. So if you have a bunch of Amazon customers and you're like, which groups of people should we send these advertisements to? You could do clustering to figure out, hey, these people might be are all, you know, young, wealthy. They might be interested in, I don't know, fancy coffee. I don't know. So you could just go through and just cluster people into different groups and then target them differently. Old people, you might not want to sell them really expensive, useless coffee. You might want to sell them things that are useful or maybe help their health. I don't know. But this is why clustering might be important. But k-means is quite simple. You have to come back and the machine learning practitioner has to define the k. And so k basically says the how many clusters do we have? Here we have 2. And then we apply an algorithm to iteratively move them together, to move them around until we find a sort of an optimal clustering. Now, I won't exactly explain what an optimal clustering is, but you can think of it as there are many ways to quantify an optimal clustering. I believe that one of them is to minimize the different distance from this average to all the different points. And once you've converged on an optimum, then you will just stay there. So in this case, the algorithm has found this solution where you have this cluster here and this cluster here. If you ask me, this seems like a pretty reasonable clustering. So I would say that the algorithm succeeded. And so yeah, this is k-means. So you define how many clusters you want, and then the algorithm will find you that many clusters in the data. Benjamin asks, 3 clusters would work here too, right? Well, this is a good question. You know, for example, you might think that this data, if you just eyeballed it, you might think that this is a cluster, maybe this is a cluster, and maybe this is a cluster. And you're absolutely right. Now, this is where the hyperparameter comes into play. Remember that k is our hyperparameter. K defines how many clusters we want. If k equaled 3, then maybe this would be the correct clustering. But because you said that there were 2 clusters, then you have to do this. Because remember that clustering is inherently an ill-defined task. You sort of, how are you supposed to know how many clusters you're supposed to find before you actually find the clusters, right? So sort of the user has to guess how many clusters are in this population of data, and then you can use an algorithm to find the optimal clusters of those 2 sizes. But that's a great question. So yeah, that's clustering. Now there's one thing that I like to finally touch on, but I think I will touch on this in the next lecture, which is how do we actually build these models, right? We've talked about how each one works, sort of how to find each one, but there has to be a systematic method that we need to employ to build models that are robust, that work well, and we can make sure that they work well before we deploy them into performance critical tasks like driving our cars, performing our surgeries, things like that. But since we're running low on time, I think I'll talk about this next time. And right now, we're going to jump into the lab. So one thing that I like to remind you all of is before the lab, I just want to remind you all of some things that we covered today. So we have machine learning, right? It's a subset of artificial intelligence that helps computers learn from data, draw insights from data. And there are these different big tasks of machine learning. There's classification, where you try to put things in bins. There's regression, where you try to predict a continuous value. And then there's clustering, which is where you don't have any of the labels on the data, but you want to figure out how they sort of relate on each other and how to put things that are similar to each other together. And then for each of these, we talked about some cool algorithms to do them. So we have decision trees, we have linear models, we have KNNs, we have k-means. Now, training and testing procedures, I'm going to cover next time because we're running a little bit low on time. But training and testing is super important for a systematic method of building these models and making sure that they work correctly. We'll talk about that next time. Now, things to be looking forward to in the machine learning landscape. In the future, we're going to be talking about artificial neural networks. This is deep learning, the hot new thing that everyone's talking about, and how these applications will extend to things like how Snapchat filters work. I'm sure you've all been curious about how they work. We'll be talking about how we can ask an AI to do our homework, how we can control smartphone apps with our voice, how we can analyze your dance moves using AI, And then at the very end, we're going to take a sneak peek into Python and to show you, to give you a taste of what's out there and what you can look forward to after you graduate from using MIT App Inventor. Because at this point, you're all fairly advanced programmers. Once you finish this course, you'll have a very good intuition for how all this AI stuff works. And so then you might be ready to sneak peek into Python. And we'll cover that at the very end of the course. So this is sort of a peek into the future for this class. But as for today, we're going to jump into the lab. So today's lab is going to be about rock, paper, scissors. Now, the whole point of today's lab is to emphasize to all of you that AI is not just about machine learning. Machine learning is what everyone associates with AI, but AI is much more broad than machine learning. It is, in general, a field that is concerned with creating intelligent machines that don't do things, that don't do naive things. They're quite smart, and they do things that are better than random. So today's lab will be quite cool because we'll be building a robot that can actually beat us at rock, paper, scissors. Now, you might think that rock, paper, scissors, I mean, I'm sure we're all familiar with this. You might think that rock, paper, scissors is a game of pure chance. But actually, this is not true. And if you and I were playing rock, paper, scissors, I wouldn't be able to do this because my memory is not so good. But if you were playing a computer, you could observe that people do have habits. For example, some people really like to play rock after they play scissors, or they really like to play scissors after they play rock, or things like that. So there are all these patterns that people have, that people exhibit, that a computer can exploit because it's so good at remembering things, for the computer to win. Now, this isn't a trivial task, right? Because the naive strategy would just be to randomly pick a move out of the 3 ones every time, but this doesn't help you do better than random. So the computer can't win just by randomly guessing moves. Then what do we do, right? This is the $1 million question. So this is going to concern a topic called Markov chains, a very cool topic, lots of applications in a lot of places. And let's just dive right into it. So let's start out with an example, right? Imagine that you are a player and you play the following sequence of moves. You play rock, paper, scissors, rock, paper, scissors, rock, paper, scissors. Do you think this is a random sequence of moves? Feel free to unmute, type your answer in chat. Okay, great. So this is clearly not a random sequence of moves. Even though that rock, appears 3 out of 9 times, paper appears 3 out of 9 times, scissors appears 3 out of 9 times, this is definitely not a random set of moves, because every time rock is played, papers comes after, and then every time papers is played, scissors comes after, etc., etc. So this is a super dumb example, a very blatantly non-random example to show you that there are strategies that can help you win at rock, paper, scissors. Because if you saw this and you saw that previously somebody had played rock, then you knew they were going to play scissors. So what would you play? What beats paper? Scissors, right? Then you would play scissors. And so then then you would win. If this was their policy to always play papers after rock and then scissors after paper and then rock after scissors, then you could win 100% of the time just by playing the sequence shifted over. So this is not random. And in case this wasn't very obvious to you at the very beginning, what we can do is we can construct a table of transition probabilities. This is one of the central ideas to a Markov chain. And the idea is that your move, your second move, or let's just say we have a variable, like your xth move is one of these 3 things, then your x plus 1 move is uniquely determined by your xth move. This is the assumption that we make. So to put this in more concrete terms, for example, if you played rock, right? What is the probability that you play rock again? Well, according to this policy, it's 0%. You never play rock again after you play paper, after you play rock. But what about paper, right? Actually, every time you play rock, you play paper immediately after. So this transition probability is 100%. And then your second move, being S, is 0, obviously. And then we can just continue filling out this table based on these rules, right? You have papers, you'll never go back to rock. You always go to scissors. So this is 100%. And then scissors, you always go back to rock. So this is 100%. So based on this table of transition probabilities, does anyone want to propose to me an algorithm that can help us win at least better than random, better than 30% of the time at rock, paper, scissors, given this table, if we construct this table. Feel free to unmute because your algorithm might be slightly complicated. Oh, okay, so Everett has an example. So maybe you play a few times and then you make this chart, and whichever move you play the most, the computer counters it. Exactly, so that's perfect. Let's say that these transition probabilities were a little bit more noisy. Let's say that in reality, somebody maybe plays rock 30% of the time after you play scissors, maybe 40% of the time here, and so this is another 30% here, and then et cetera, et cetera. So then basically what would happen is, let's say that this is you, this is the computer. We have a little table here. And let's say the first time you play rock, the computer plays scissors, you win. So you win. Okay. But then that after you play rock, there's a 40% chance you're going to play paper. And so, of course, this is not deterministic. Like, you're not going to be able to say, oh, with 100% certainty, this guy's going to play paper. But this is your best guess, and it'll help you win on average better than random. So then the computer will be like, okay, so I think he's going to play paper. So then what counters paper? What counters paper? Scissors counters paper, right? So then the optimal move for the computer would be to play scissors. And then if it actually turns out to be that you played rock, if it turns out to be that you played paper and the computer played scissors, then the computer would win, right? Of course, like if you played rock, then that would be bad because then the computer would lose. And if you played scissors, you would tie. But it's most probable, based on the things that we observed before, that you're going to be playing papers. So this is the fundamental idea. Everett is spot on. Now, this is the idea that we're going to be using to create a bot that is going to be better at rock, paper, scissors than we are. And we're going to be doing this in MIT App Inventor. This is not going to be too hard to implement. And so the question is this. I think one thing that Everett left out is, maybe you play a few times and then you make this chart, and whichever more you play, the computer counters it. Do you think we should keep this chart static? Do you think we should be updating it every time we play? Do you think we should be discarding super old values? How do you think we should implement this? And there's no right answer here, I don't think. Just discussion. Yeah, I think continuously adding to this table is a good policy. So always updating. So maybe initially we have a table. Let's just create a 3x3 table. Initially, it's all zeros, right? And then we can simply do this update based on what the user played. Maybe suddenly, they played a 1 here. And then, next time they have 1 here, they have 1 here. And every time, you just look at the maximum. The maximums are here, and you try to counter that move. So this would be how you would build a model. So this would be how you build the AI. And in the long run, once this computer really starts to understand you, then you'll win. The computer will win. Now there's a caveat here. Obviously, if you want to mess with the computer, then you should just play randomly, because if all of these transition probabilities are 33%, then the computer is just randomly guessing as to what you're going to do next, and it really has no idea. And so if your policy is to play completely randomly, then in the long run, you'll be tying with the computer. However, this is very, very hard to do as a human. Humans all have these different tendencies based on how the buttons are placed with respect to each other, and et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be very unlikely for these probabilities to all be 33%. So in the long run, if you play this enough times, you will eventually lose to the computer. It'll become smarter than you. So I hope you can see here that AI is not just about machine learning. I don't think you can consider this strictly a machine learning problem, because you don't have this huge data set. You're basically being smart just by looking at the facts modeling this as a Markov chain and being like, well, we can do better than random by tracking this user's moves and countering whatever move that they're trying to do most. So this is a case of sort of more general artificial intelligence, even though it's not using these weird machine learning methods, but it's still very cool. And then so we're going to be implementing this, and then in the future, we'll be really zeroing in on machine learning because there's so much to talk about there. So many cool things that we'll be able to do, like building our own Snapchat filters. We'll be building tools that can do our homework, that can let us control our phones using our voice, etc. But for today, we're going to give you a taste of general AI, and then we'll go from there. So if everyone wants to fire up an instance of MIT App Inventor, I will meet you there. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll be screen sharing while we do this, so just go ahead and open up your MIT App Inventor, and then we'll be coding this together. Now, this is actually quite a complicated implementation that, it's complicated enough such that we won't be able to finish it in class. So then your homework will be to finish this and show us that, your AI is smarter than you are. Okay, so go ahead and go to MIT App Inventor and start a new project. I'll call this project Rock, Paper, Scissors Bot. And yeah, go ahead and start your new project. It should be blank. And then send like an okay in the chat once you're finished so that I know. And I'll give people a couple minutes to do this. So if you're in a car, that's going to be tough because if you have a hotspot, then you can connect it. Otherwise, then you will just have to do this when you get home. We'll be posting the recording so you can follow along there. All right, cool. Looks like most people are ready. So then we'll go ahead and start building out the interface. So I guess the question is, what do we want the interface to look like? We don't want to make it that fancy. I think we'll just keep it simple. I think one thing that we need to keep track of is our score. So maybe let's build a score tracker. So let's go ahead and use a horizontal arrangement, drag in some labels here. So this label is useless, but we'll just say like your score. And then can we duplicate this? No, we can't. Okay, we'll do this again. Another horizontal arrangement, another label, and then, whoops, we'll say that this is a computer's score. And then since we're going to be updating these, I think it would be a good idea to give them actual names. So label your score. It's always good convention to name important variables correctly. And this is label computer score. I'll zoom in a bit in case it's too small. So you have all of these two different things. We'll set the default value to 0 or something like that. And there we go. So we have your score is 0, computer score is 0. Nice. And then we also want to have a display for what exactly you, whoops. We want to have a display for what exactly the moves are that have been made. So we'll want to do this again. We need 2 more horizontal arrangements. Uh-oh. Apologies, bear with me. Okay, and then we'll have 2 more, and then we need to have a bunch more labels. And this one will be your move. Computers move. And then we'll want to rename this to label your move. This one will want to be label computer move. Okay. Oh, also, thank you very much for the suggestion. Table arrangement might be easier. You're completely right about this. I'll just continue this since I'm already done, but you're definitely right. We probably should have used the table arrangement here. That's a good idea. We'll keep it in mind for next time. So you have all of these different things, and you have all of this, right? So then what we want to do is, let's see. We'll want to maybe have some buttons. Like let's just put another horizontal arrangement, and we'll put in 3 buttons because this will allow you to choose whether to do rock, paper, or scissors. Let's make sure that this horizontal arrangement has the width of the parent, and then we can have each of these fill the parent. And then this one will be rock, paper, scissors. Okay, great. All right. And then perhaps you also want a reset button. Let's say reset. And then we'll name all these buttons with button reset. This one is button scissors. This one is button paper. This one is button rock. All right, so we have these things, all good. And then, yeah, so let me know if you guys are all good with this. Type in like an okay in the chat if you're all here with all your variables named and things. And then I'll give people like a couple of minutes to build out this interface. Okay, great. Looks like people are progressing along quite nicely. If anyone needs more time, actually, just let me know before I move on. Okay, cool. Well, then I think right now is a good time to go into the logic, and we can think about how we want to do everything. So currently, does anyone have any ideas? Like what's probably the first thing that we should do? Or just what is one thing that we can do first?
Create variable.
Yeah, exactly, right? So let's create some global variables to keep track of our scores. So there, you could put this in an array. I think that maybe this is easier. So maybe we'll say scores. We'll create a list. Scores. We'll create a list out of numbers. They start at 0. And let's just say, I don't know if they're comments, but we'll just put a comment here. First one is your score. Second one is computer score. This is our little comment here to remind us what's happening. And then, so these are our scores. Are there any other variables that we need to keep track of? I don't really think so. Cool. And then I think there's another thing that we want to do to make life easier for us. Yeah, I think it's going to make life easier for us. We should make a new dictionary that maps our indices to our values. So our key, oh, actually, I think MIT App Inventor is 1 index, right? Can you all remind me? I don't quite remember.
I think it's 1 index.
Right, a list is enough, right?
Okay, so it's 1 indexed. It starts with 1. Then we want to map this to our values. So this would be rock, and this one would be paper, scissors.
But why don't you make a list? Because you don't need the index. A list has an index.
Yeah.
already.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's right. That also works if you want. Okay, cool. And we'll just call this moves or something like that. All right. So we have this. Now we might want to say, okay, well, maybe this is the thing. Like whenever something is clicked, we want to choose a random number. And this will be very easy to do with a random number generator. Let's just try to think things through. What kind of methods do we need? We need a method to figure out who has won, right? That's sort of one thing that we need to do. And so we might want to say, well, actually, I'll let you guys take control. So what do you guys think is the next thing that we need to do here?
Event handler.
Okay, so maybe we'll say that once something is clicked, like once the rock, paper, scissors, each of those is clicked, down here, we'll need to do something. So whenever this one is clicked, whenever this one is clicked, whenever this one is clicked. Now, what does everyone think that we should be putting in here? Any ideas? So currently we basically need to build out the mechanics of the game before we can do this smart Markov chain thing. So what goes in these event handlers?
You could set the text for the player's move to say their move.
Sure, right? We could make a move and then we could do things. So I think maybe one easy way we could do this is to write a function that takes in a computer's move and takes in a user move, and then it'll do everything else. It'll generate everything, it'll return things, etc., etc. So maybe we can create a procedure that takes in
It's like a compute,
a certain
compete.
Yeah, right. Takes in a user input, like a user move, and then it'll do a bunch of different things. It'll generate a new thing. It'll generate a new move for the computer, and then it'll do a bunch of different things that we need it to do. So let's do that. Let's initialize a computer move to a random number. So how do we do this? We go to math, probably. We can do a random integer from 1 to 3, right? Because this tells us whether it's rock, paper, or scissors. So then when we call this, let's just call it. What do you think we should call it? We'll call it like execute, whoops.
Or compete.
Okay, compete works. Okay, so it'll be compete, and then we can call this method by calling compete, and then so we should pass in our user move. It'll be easier if we pass in our user move as a number, so then this should just be 1. And then we can duplicate this, and then we can be like rock, paper, and scissors. Cool. So then now we have the user move, we have the computer move. What's the first thing that we might want to do? Okay, so you have a question, how do you get the user move into the procedure? Oh, that's a great question. You can add parameters by clicking this blue thing, the thing. You can drag in a new parameter, and then it'll put the parameter in, and then you can rename it. All right, so there was a suggestion that we need to set our labels correctly. So let's go ahead and do that. Then we want to go into our horizontal arrangement. We want to label, we want to set the move, your move, the computer move. We want to set both of these pieces of text. So we want to set your move to the thing that is at the index of the user move of global moves. So we would go into lists and we would get the item in the list, select list item, I think is the correct thing. And then the index here would be user move, and the index here would be computer move. So let's see if this actually works. Let's connect our thing, and let's see if it actually works. AirDroid. And I'll be demonstrating this over the internet. So we have about 15 minutes left. I think what we'll do is we'll just like go ahead and build out all of the mechanics of the game, and then your assignment at home will be to finish everything up and build out the Markov stuff. All right, so this is my phone. We can go to the App Embedder companion, and then I'm going to connect it real quick. It's connecting. So here we go. So then if I click things, my move is rock, my move is paper. And then if I keep clicking it, the computer's just going to generate some random one. And then scissors right here, it'll generate some random one. So yeah, clearly the mechanics here are working properly. We're good. So we verified that it's working and we can continue. So after we've set the labels, what's the next thing that we need to do to just implement the mechanics of the game?
Determine the winner.
Score, right? Exactly. Don is right. We need to score things. And to do that, we need to figure out whether something won or not, whether somebody has won or not. So let's create a new procedure for this. Let's say we have a procedure and it should actually return something. So actually, we can actually just also implement it as an if statement. We don't need to create a new function for this. So then we have a set of things. So does anyone want to suggest to me a way that we can formulate the winning relationship? What is the thing that should be put into this if statement here so that we can determine whether somebody won or not? In terms of the indices, remember, like we had rock, paper, scissors, and what is the relationship here? So rock loses to paper, paper loses to scissors, and scissors loses to rock, right? So how do we make this work?
Larger index value wins.
Okay, right. So like if you think about rock, paper, scissors, the paper is a bigger index than the rock, the scissors is a bigger paper index than the paper, and et cetera, and et cetera. So that's a good way to do things. So I guess the first thing that we need to check is if the indices are the same, in which case there's a tie. So maybe that's the first thing that we can check. So we can go into math and we can be like, if the user move is equal to the computer move, then we don't actually want to do anything. So then the score does not actually change. So in this case, if we wanted to set like a label that says whoever won, we can do this. We can just put it here. And then we can put this label as winner shown here. And this actually should be move here. We can put NA. So, and also we would want to set this label and we'd like label winner. And then we would basically say that label winner would set the text to tie game, nobody scores a point. Because if they're equal, then nothing happens. So then you have a couple of other situations. So let's write these out. Let's go to unfiled notes. Let's go to Scratchpad. And let's go here. So let's think this through. So we have rock. We have rock. We have paper. We have scissors. This is at index 1. This is at index 2. This is at index 3. So we've already covered the case in which the indices are the same. So now we'll need to figure out what's going on, like who is one. So let's say that the user is here and the computer is here. Then you need to figure out which one is greater than the other, right? Like if 2 is greater than 1, then the computer wins. And then that's fine. So then and also if like 3 is greater than 2, then the person on 3 wins. The only tricky thing is what happens when you have 1 on 1 and 1 on 3. Does anyone see a problem here?
Tie.
Sorry?
You can get a tie where it's the same.
Right. So like they're the same, but then what happens? So does our rule break when 2 is greater than 1 and 3 is greater than 2? And then so then what about 1 and 3? What is the relationship between 1 and 3? Right? Because rock beats scissors. 3 is greater than 1, but rock actually beats scissors. So this actually breaks our rule. But does anyone have any trick in mind that we can use to fix this?
If the computer picks scissors, then the rule doesn't apply.
Okay, so that is one solution. So one solution is just to be like, the rule doesn't apply when the computer picks scissors. That's one way to go about it. Does anyone have any other ideas?
Rotate the numbers.
Okay, so how do we rotate the numbers? Any thoughts? It's kind of like a cool trick.
Okay, so only when the user picks scissors, that's a special case. So we can set it to 0 instead of 3. I mean, it's like a modular of 3.
Right. Okay, so then what we're seeing the suggestion here is if you have scissors, then you would actually just mod 3, which becomes 0. So then scissors would become 0, and you have this right here. And then so the rule still applies. So this is going to be a little bit tricky to implement. And we're also sort of running out of time. So I think that in this place, we're at a good stopping point, right? Because you're going to have this. I want you to think about how to implement this in sort of like the easiest way possible. This is sort of like an exercise for you. And then after this, you have the mechanics all down, right? Because if you win, then if the user wins, then you increment the user score. If the other person wins, then you increment the computer score. And then so you're done with the mechanics. And then the only other thing is to figure out whether how to choose the computer move so that the user is most likely to lose. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions as to what the assignment is? Yeah, cool. So this should be pretty fun. Once you build it out, you'll be able to see, like, if you just keep clicking rock, initially the computer won't really know what's going on, but then the more that you do it, they'll be able to figure out like, hey, you're always playing rock, so let me just always play paper. So you'll start to lose very quickly. And then the more you play, the better the computer gets. So then it'll start to win more and more often. So this is gonna be fun. Let us know if you have any questions in the Discord, if you're ever stuck with something, but just keep doing things like you would with any other programming project. So make sure to continually test your code to make sure that you're not putting some really confusing bug inside in the middle. And then, and yeah.
Hey, Kevin,
There are
a
other
question.
questions.